The moment I saw Jason's name in my DMs, my pulse quickened in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I'd followed him for years, a well-known lifestyle blogger, known for his effortless charisma, piercing eyes, and this maddening ability to pull people into his orbit. He was everything you'd imagine a social media star to be: cocky, painfully attractive, and utterly intoxicating. I could never have guessed that he'd ever notice someone like me. A woman who was, well, comfortably settled. Married with a steady job, a mortgage, and dreams that I had once chased but had long since packed away. It started with innocent messages. At first, I'd convinced myself that it was all harmless. He's just another guy, just a friend, I kept repeating. But in the back of my mind, I knew that wasn't entirely true. Jason's texts were thrilling, full of clever banter and deep questions that made me feel understood in a way I hadn't felt in years. My husband Tom was a good man. Steady, reliable, a constant force. But after nearly a decade together, our lives had drifted into this calm monotony that neither of us could seem to shake. With Jason, everything felt alive. He asked about my interests, my dreams, the books I loved, and the places I'd always wanted to visit. He knew just what to say to make me feel like I was standing on the edge of some cliff, ready to leap. His world was so different from my own. A world of freedom, travel, glamour, and unapologetic indulgence. And he was inviting me in. One evening, while Tom was away on a business trip, Jason invited me to meet up for drinks. I told myself it was just coffee, just a harmless conversation. Yet the moment I walked into that dimly lit bar and saw him, I felt every defense I'd ever built start to dissolve. He stood up when he saw me, smiling in that disarming way of his eyes tracing over me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. The conversation was magnetic. Jason leaned in close, his hand grazing mine as he laughed at something I'd said. Every glance felt heavy, like we were sharing secrets without saying a word. I could feel a subtle tension building between us, as if every word, every laugh, was pulling us closer together. It was electric and frightening. Part of me wanted to run, but the other part was rooted to the spot, unwilling to break the spell he was weaving around me. After a few hours, he reached across the table, his fingers barely touching mine, and whispered, "Why don't we get out of here?" I hesitated, feeling a pang of guilt as Tom's face flashed in my mind. But something inside me, something that had been dormant for years, was screaming for this. To feel wanted, desired, alive. I nodded, and together we walked out into the cool night, the city lights blurring around us as he took my hand. We ended up at his place, a stunning apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. Jason poured us wine, his gaze intense as he handed me the glass. We talked, laughed, and shared stories about our lives, our dreams. He made me feel like I was the only woman in the world, the only one who mattered. At some point, he brushed a strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering against my cheek. My heart pounded as he leaned in, his breath warm against my skin, and before I knew it, our lips met. It was slow and intense, each kiss deeper than the last, unraveling everything I'd been holding back for so long. His hands traced over my body, and I felt myself melting under his touch, surrendering to a desire that had been growing inside me since that very first message. In that moment, I was lost. Lost in the feel of his hands, his lips, the way he looked at me like I was some rare, beautiful thing he couldn't resist. It felt raw and real, a kind of passion I hadn't felt in years. I knew it was wrong, that this moment was temporary, that eventually I'd have to face the consequences. But right then, nothing else mattered. I felt alive, seen, understood in a way I hadn't felt in what felt like forever. The next morning, reality hit me like a tidal wave. As I lay in his bed, tangled in sheets that still smelled of him, the weight of what I'd done settled over me. Guilt gnawed at me, twisting in my stomach, but there was another feeling too. A kind of sadness and ache that I couldn't ignore. Because for one fleeting night, I had tasted a life I'd never known was possible, a part of myself that I'd thought was long gone. And now I would have to go back, carrying the memory of it with me. When I got home, I saw Tom's face, his familiar smile, the way he looked at me with that quiet love and trust that I had taken for granted. Shame washed over me, and I had to turn away, unable to meet his eyes. But beneath the shame there was something else. A part of me that felt changed, that now knew a life beyond the one I'd built with him. Jason continued to text me afterward, casual messages that suggested more meetings, more secret nights. I knew it couldn't last, that I couldn't live with this dual life forever. But a part of me ached for it, for that forbidden thrill that I knew I'd never find again in the quiet, predictable life I'd chosen. Now I'm left with the memory, the secret I carry in silence, and the realization that a single night can change everything. Both a taste of freedom and a painful reminder of everything I've risked. And yet, I can't deny that a part of me, a small hidden part, would do it all over again. After that night, the ache in my chest grew, a reminder of something beautiful I could never have again. Days slipped by, but the memories of Jason stayed sharp, like an old scar that hadn't healed. I could still feel the warmth of his hand on my cheek, his voice low in my ear, asking me questions that felt so real, so raw. He was the kind of man who saw straight through to your core, peeling back layers until there was nothing left but the truth. When his texts would pop up, my heart would skip, caught between the desire to feel that thrill again and the guilt of keeping such a secret from Tom. I told myself each time, this is the last message. I won't reply anymore. But the loneliness crept in during quiet moments, and I'd find myself reading his messages, poring over each word as though they held some secret I couldn't live without. Jason always knew just what to say, how to keep me tethered to him, always at arm's length, always a little too far away. It wasn't long before we arranged to meet again. I told myself I'd keep it simple, that we'd just talk. I'd even rehearse things I wanted to say, ways to draw boundaries, things that would make it clear that our connection was just a friendship. But when he met me at a small, tucked-away coffee shop, his smile disarmed me all over again. He leaned in close, his eyes locking onto mine in that way that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. Every worry, every rehearsed line vanished. My heart raced, my hands trembled under the table. We talked, though I could hardly recall what was said, lost in the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel like we were sharing some secret that no one else could understand. Our innocent meeting turned into a day together, strolling around the city, hand in hand, as if we were old lovers. At some point as we crossed the street, Jason pulled me close, laughing about something I'd said. His hand grazed my waist, and in that instant, it felt like he was daring me to lean in, to forget everything else and just be there with him. I didn't pull away. I didn't want to. With every hour, I was drifting further from my old life and deeper into a world that didn't belong to me. And that realization should have scared me, but instead it left me craving more. Over the next weeks, I found myself walking around in a daze. Tom would talk to me about our life, our plans, our mortgage, and I'd nod, responding with the right words, the appropriate smiles. But my mind was somewhere else, replaying moments with Jason, our private conversations, the little touches that felt so much more than just friendly. There was this side of myself that only he could bring out, and as much as I tried to pull away, to bury it, it kept rising to the surface, refusing to be silenced. One evening, Tom and I were watching TV together, his hand resting comfortably on my leg, his attention fully on the screen. I remember glancing over at him, feeling a pang of guilt but also frustration. The life we shared was safe, predictable, but I found myself wondering if predictable was enough for me. Jason's words echoed in my mind, our conversations about dreams, about living fully. There was this growing chasm between the life I had and the life I'd tasted, and I couldn't ignore it. It was a Friday night when Jason texted me to meet him again. My heart raced at his invitation, my fingers hovering over my phone as I thought about the lie I'd need to tell Tom to make it happen. I made up an excuse about seeing a friend, hating myself for the way the lie rolled so easily off my tongue. Tom looked at me with that quiet trust, and I felt a sinking sensation in my chest, a mixture of guilt and anticipation. He kissed me goodbye, his lips warm and familiar, but my mind was already somewhere else. Jason and I met at a rooftop bar. The city spread out beneath us, lights twinkling against the dark sky. He looked at me, his gaze soft but piercing, and I knew he could see right through me. The tension between us was electric, unspoken words hanging in the air. We sat close, talking about everything and nothing, as though this moment was all that mattered. At some point, he reached across, his hand covering mine, his thumb tracing gentle circles that sent shivers up my spine. He leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't stop thinking about you." The words lingered, settling in the air between us. I swallowed, my heart pounding, and for a moment, I felt every wall I'd built start to crumble. Without another word, he took my hand, leading me to the edge of the rooftop where we stood in silence, the world blurring around us. He pulled me close, his hand on the small of my back, and I could feel the heat radiating from him, our breaths mingling in the cool night air. When his lips brushed mine, it was soft, tentative, as if he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I leaned in, letting myself get lost in the feeling, the way his hands moved to hold me tighter, as though he was afraid I'd disappear. The night stretched on, each kiss, each touch deepening the connection between us. Every moment felt like it could be the last, and I clung to it, letting myself forget everything else. In his arms I felt free, like I could be anyone, do anything. There was no guilt, no responsibilities, only this intoxicating rush of passion that felt like it would never end. But as dawn approached, reality crashed back in. I knew I had to go back to Tom, to the life I'd built, even though it now felt like a distant memory, a shadow compared to the vivid intensity of my time with Jason. Slipping out of Jason's apartment, I felt the weight of my choices settle heavily on my shoulders. The thrill had faded, replaced by a hollow ache that gnawed at me as I made my way home. When I walked through the door, Tom was waiting, his face lighting up as he asked how my night had gone. I forced a smile, weaving together another lie as guilt twisted in my stomach. He kissed me, his arms wrapping around me in a warm embrace, and I felt like I was drowning, caught between two worlds that could never coexist. Over the following days, I tried to distance myself from Jason, to put an end to whatever this was, but every time I thought about letting go, I felt a painful tug in my chest. He had awakened something inside me, a longing I couldn't ignore, and the thought of losing that part of myself felt unbearable. And so the cycle continued. I would go back to Jason, drawn to him like a moth to a flame, each meeting deeper, more intense than the last. I knew I was playing with fire, risking everything, but I couldn't stop. Jason had become my escape, my secret, my own personal thrill. But secrets don't stay hidden forever. One evening, as I was lying in bed beside Tom, my phone lit up with a message from Jason. I glanced at it, my heart lurching as I saw his name, and I quickly turned the screen off, hoping Tom hadn't noticed. But he had. He turned to me, his brow furrowed, and asked who it was. The look on his face was a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, and I felt a cold sweat break out as I stumbled over my words, my mind racing to come up with an explanation. Tom didn't press further, but I could see a shadow of doubt in his eyes, a crack in the trust that had once seemed unbreakable. And for the first time, I felt the true weight of my choices, the fragility of everything I'd taken for granted. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I realized that I was standing on the edge of a cliff, a choice that could either pull me back to safety or send me spiraling into an unknown I wasn't sure I could face. In the days that followed, I tried to bury my thoughts, to drown out Jason's voice in my head with the routines of my life with Tom. I busied myself with work, meticulously organized my tasks, cleaned every corner of the house. I thought that, if I could keep moving, maybe I could shake the feeling gnawing at me. But no matter how hard I tried to immerse myself, there was a hollow ache that kept drawing me back to my phone, to Jason's last text, which still sat unanswered in my inbox. Then late one evening, Jason's name flashed across my screen again. This time he didn't ask to meet. His message was short, almost cold in its simplicity. "Do you regret it?" I stared at those words, feeling my heart twist painfully in my chest. Did I regret it? Part of me wanted to shout yes, to erase everything that had happened and go back to the quiet safety of my life before. But I knew that wasn't the full truth. I didn't regret the way he made me feel alive, seen, understood in ways that Tom, through no fault of his own, simply couldn't. That night with Jason had cracked something open inside me, something I hadn't even realized was buried. How could I regret that, even with everything it had cost? Without fully thinking it through, I typed a response. "I don't know. I think about it every day." A few minutes passed, and then his reply came. "Meet me. Just one last time." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. One last time. The words felt like a dare, a promise, something final. Deep down, I knew there was no such thing as one last time with Jason. But I couldn't bring myself to say no. I wanted that feeling one more time, that electricity, the way he looked at me like I was the only person who mattered. I made an excuse to Tom about needing a few hours alone to clear my head. He nodded, too absorbed in his own work to question it, and I felt a pang of guilt twist in my stomach. But I was already halfway out the door before I could second-guess myself. already thinking about Jason, about what it would feel like to see him again. We met at a quiet spot by the river, where the city lights reflected off the dark water in a soft, shimmering glow. Jason was waiting there, leaning against the railing, his face half lit by the golden light of a nearby street lamp. When he looked up and saw me, there was something different in his expression, a kind of sadness mixed with his usual confidence. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, and there was a softness to his voice that made my heart ache. We walked along the riverbank, neither of us saying much. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words, and the tension between us felt sharper than ever. Finally Jason turned to me, his gaze intense. "Why him?" he asked. "Why stay if you're so unhappy?" The question caught me off guard. I'd never truly considered leaving Tom. It had always felt like an impossibility, something I couldn't even fathom. But now, standing there with Jason, the words hung in the air, waiting for an answer I didn't have. "Because he's my home," I whispered, barely able to meet Jason's eyes. "He's safe. We built a life together. I can't just walk away from that." Jason's jaw tightened, and he nodded, looking out over the water as if searching for something he couldn't find. "But where does that leave us?" he asked, his voice low, almost vulnerable. I had no answer. All I could do was stare at him, feeling torn between the life I knew and the life I'd tasted, between the comfort of Tom and the thrill of Jason. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, one foot hovering over the abyss, unsure whether to leap or pull back. Jason took my hand, his fingers warm against mine, and I felt that familiar rush of energy, that magnetic pull. "Come with me," he whispered, his voice soft but urgent. "Just for a little while. Let's go somewhere, leave everything behind. You and me. No complications, no consequences." The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. I imagined what it would be like to run away with him, to escape the confines of my everyday life, to live freely, wildly, without anyone to answer to. But I knew it was a fantasy, a dream that would crumble the moment reality set in. "I can't," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I can't just leave." Jason's face softened, and he let out a sigh, his hand dropping from mine. "I know," he said quietly. "I knew it the whole time. I thought maybe." His words trailed off, and I felt a sharp pang in my chest, knowing that whatever this was between us was slipping away. I wanted to reach out, to hold on to him, to ask him to stay. But I knew that I couldn't keep living this double life, couldn't keep tearing myself apart. We stood there in silence, the distance between us widening, a chasm that neither of us could cross. Finally, Jason leaned in, brushing a soft kiss against my cheek. "Take care of yourself," he murmured, his voice filled with a sadness that broke my heart. And then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving me standing alone by the river, watching him fade into the darkness. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a sense of loss that I couldn't explain. Part of me wanted to chase after him, to call his name, to ask him to stay. But I knew that this was the end, that I had to let go, that the life I'd tasted with him was not meant to be mine. As I walked back home, the weight of my choices settled over me, the reality of what I'd done sinking in. I knew that I would carry this secret with me, a part of my heart forever marked by the memory of him. That night I returned home to find Tom sitting on the couch, waiting for me. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable, a mix of worry and something else, something that made my heart pound in fear. He hadn't been waiting up for me in ages, not like this, and his silence felt heavy, foreboding. I felt a pang of guilt, the kind that twisted into shame, but I forced myself to stay calm, to act like everything was normal. "Hey," I said softly, hoping my voice didn't betray me. "Why are you still up?" He studied me for a long moment, as though searching my face for some hidden truth, his eyes tracing over me in a way that felt uncomfortably thorough. "I just wanted to talk," he finally said, his voice thick. "It feels like you've been distant. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I feel like something's changed." The words hung in the air between us, and I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. Had he noticed? Had I been that transparent? I tried so hard to keep my two worlds separate, to protect him from what he could never understand. But now, with him looking at me like that, I felt exposed, like he could see every lie, every betrayal. I forced a smile, hoping it looked genuine. No, nothing's changed, I said, the lie heavy on my tongue. I've just been stressed with work and everything. You know how it is. But he didn't look convinced. Instead, he looked hurt, as though my words only deepened the wound he was already feeling. You're not the same, Sarah, he whispered, his voice cracking. I don't know what's going on, but I feel like I'm losing you. Hearing those words spoken so softly, so earnestly, felt like a knife to the heart. I wanted to reach out, to tell him that he hadn't lost me, that everything was okay. But how could I say that when deep down I knew it wasn't true? When I knew that, in some ways, he already had lost a part of me, a part one could never give back. I took his hand, squeezing it gently, feeling the warmth and familiarity of his touch. You haven't lost me, Tom, I whispered, trying to believe the words even as I spoke them. I'm here. I promise. He nodded slowly, but there was a sadness in his eyes that didn't fade, an unspoken understanding that lingered between us. I could feel the weight of my actions pressing down on me, the guilt wrapping around my heart, suffocating me. But I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth, to shatter the fragile life we'd built together. As the days passed, Tom's quiet sadness remained, a silent reminder of the distance I'd created. He was still the same, kind, patient, always there when I needed him. But I could feel the shift between us, a chasm that I'd carved out with my own hands, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't close it. I couldn't forget Jason, couldn't erase the memory of his touch, his words, the way he'd made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as I was scrolling through my phone, I found myself checking Jason's profile again, like I was drawn to him by some invisible force. His latest post was a picture of him traveling, laughing with a group of friends, his face relaxed, carefree. There was no trace of the man who'd whispered promises to me, who'd asked me to leave everything behind for him. It was like I was looking at a stranger. I felt a pang of longing, but also an ache of realization. Jason had moved on, gone back to his life, the life I'd only glimpsed for a fleeting moment. I was just a chapter in his story, one that he'd already closed. But for me, he was a wound that wouldn't heal, a memory I couldn't shake, a secret that haunted me every day. Over time, I tried to forget him, to bury the memories and rebuild the life I'd nearly torn apart. I focused on Tom, on our marriage, on the small, quiet moments that we shared. He still looked at me with that same love, the kind that felt both comforting and stifling. I tried to find solace in it, to remind myself of the reasons I'd chosen this life. But no matter how hard I tried, there was a part of me that remained restless, always yearning for something I couldn't quite name. Months passed and the ache dulled, but it never fully disappeared. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my mind drifting back to that rooftop with Jason, to the way he'd held me, the way he'd looked at me like I was something precious, something worth fighting for. And I knew that, no matter how much time passed, a part of me would always belong to him, a part one could never get back. And then one evening, as I was going through old photos, I stumbled upon a picture of Tom and me from years ago, back when we'd first started dating. We were both laughing, arms wrapped around each other, eyes bright with hope and love. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a surge of emotion rise within me. This was the man who'd stood by me, who'd loved me without question, without condition. And here I was, keeping secrets, holding on to memories of someone who'd left without a second thought. I realized then that I had a choice. I could keep living in the shadow of what might have been, clinging to the thrill of a love that was never meant to last. Or I could choose to let go, to truly commit to the life I'd chosen, the man who still looked at me with love, despite everything I'd done. So that night, as Tom and I sat together in our quiet home, I reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. He looked at me, surprise flickering in his eyes, and I felt a rush of gratitude, of love, for this man who'd stood by me, who'd waited for me to come back to him. I love you, Tom, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. And I'm sorry for everything. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't demand answers. Instead, he simply pulled me close, wrapping me in his arms, holding me as though he'd known all along, as though he'd been waiting for this moment. And in that embrace I felt a warmth, a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. I knew that the memory of Jason would always linger, a reminder of a life I'd glimpsed but could never truly have. But as I held Tom, feeling the steady beat of his heart against mine, I knew that I'd made my choice, that I'd found my way back to the life I'd almost lost. The road to forgiveness, to rebuilding, would be long and difficult. There would be days when the memories resurfaced, when the ache returned, when the temptation to reach out would be strong. But I knew that I would resist, that I would choose Tom over and over again, because in the end he was my home. And as I closed my eyes, resting my head against his shoulder, I felt a quiet resolve settle within me. I was ready to move forward, to let go of the past, to embrace the life I had, with all its flaws and imperfections. I was ready to love Tom fully, to be the wife he deserved. Because sometimes love isn't about the thrill, the excitement, the chase. Sometimes it's about staying, about holding on, even when the road gets rough. And I knew that, for the rest of my life, I would hold on to Tom, to the quiet, steady love we'd built together. A love that would withstand any storm, any temptation, because it was real. And that, I realized, was enough. As I lay there, wrapped in Tom's arms, I felt an unexpected sense of peace, like I'd finally closed a door that had haunted me for far too long. And yet, the path forward wasn't as simple as just deciding to stay. Jason's presence lingered like a ghost, creeping into my mind at the most unexpected times. It wasn't just the memory of him, but the memory of the version of myself I'd found when I was with him. A woman unburdened, unapologetically alive. That part of me, that thrill, hadn't died. I'd merely hidden it away, folded it neatly and tucked it back where I thought it belonged. But the truth was, I didn't want to lose that part of myself, even as I fought to rebuild my life with Tom. I started seeking small ways to bring pieces of that vibrant, daring woman into my everyday life, through small changes at first, like wearing colors I'd always thought were too bold, signing up for yoga classes I'd wanted to take for years but had never found the time for. Tom noticed, his eyes lighting up when he saw me in the mornings, dressed in new clothes or with a touch of makeup I rarely wore before. He'd pull me close, kiss me on the forehead and say, "You look happy." And I'd smile, knowing that in a strange way maybe I was. As the weeks went by, Tom and I began rediscovering each other in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was more open with him, more willing to tell him about my own dreams, my frustrations, the things I'd let go of over the years. We started going out more, trying new restaurants, exploring parts of the city we'd neglected in favor of the familiar. I saw a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there in years, a curiosity that made my heart swell with gratitude, but also with a hint of sadness for everything we'd lost in the first place. One night, after a long dinner, he turned to me, his face serious yet open. "Sarah, do you ever feel like you're missing something?" he asked, his voice gentle, almost hesitant. The question caught me off guard. I felt the urge to deny it, to reassure him that I was happy, that I had everything I needed. But the trust we were building again demanded honesty, so I took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes," I admitted, my voice soft. "I think I lost sight of myself somewhere along the way. Somewhere between work and the routines I forgot what it was like to feel free, to feel alive." Tom's expression softened, and he reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "I've felt that too," he said quietly. "I just didn't know how to say it. I thought maybe it was just me. Maybe I was the one who couldn't keep up." He laughed, a little self-consciously, and my heart broke at his vulnerability. We sat there for a long time, holding hands in the quiet warmth of our kitchen, both of us absorbing the weight of our own words. It was as though we'd reached a new understanding, a place where we could finally see each other without the walls, without the defenses we'd built up over the years. That night, as we lay in bed together, I felt a surge of tenderness for Tom that was almost overwhelming. I reached for him, tracing gentle circles on his arm as we lay in the dark. And he responded, his hand covering mine, pulling me closer in a way that was both familiar and new. We held each other like that, wrapped in a silence that felt comforting rather than stifling. For the first time, I felt the possibility of rediscovering the passion we'd once shared. Not by chasing something outside of our marriage, but by rekindling what we already had, what we'd forgotten along the way. Over the following months, our relationship deepened in ways I couldn't have imagined. We started going on trips together, taking weekends to escape the city, finding new experiences to share. We laughed more, argued more, shared more. Tom wasn't perfect and neither was I, but we were learning to be open, to be raw with each other in ways that didn't require hiding or pretending. But Jason still haunted my thoughts, his memory lingering like a shadow that I couldn't shake, no matter how much I tried to immerse myself in my life with Tom. I thought about him on quiet afternoons, wondering if he'd ever think of me, if he'd ever questioned what might have been. In those moments I'd feel the tug of temptation again, the urge to reach out, to see if there was still something left between us. But I resisted. I'd made my choice and I owed it to myself and to Tom to honor that choice. Then one day, months after I'd last seen Jason, I received a text from him. It was brief, just a simple "hey," but it was enough to shake me. I stared at it, my heart pounding, my hands trembling slightly as I considered what to do. The urge to respond was overwhelming, the curiosity gnawing at me, but I knew that opening that door again would only bring pain, for both me and Tom. But as the days went by, the message lingered in my mind, a temptation I couldn't ignore. So one afternoon while Tom was out, I took a deep breath and replied. I kept it short, simple, asking how he was, hoping that a quick exchange would be enough to satisfy the ache that lingered within me. Jason responded almost immediately, and before I knew it, we were caught in a conversation that felt both familiar and dangerously alluring. He told me about his travels, his new projects, his life that seemed both thrilling and lonely. I told him about my changes, about how Tom and I were working on rebuilding our marriage, on rediscovering each other. There was a part of me that hoped he'd understand, that he'd let me go. But his responses were laced with nostalgia, with reminders of the nights we'd shared, the moments that had bound us together in ways I couldn't easily forget. As our conversation continued, I felt that familiar pull, the thrill that had once consumed me. Jason was still the same, charming, intense, the kind of man who made you feel like you were the only person who mattered. And in those few messages, I felt myself slipping, caught between the life I'd chosen and the life I could have had. But then, as I was about to reply to one of his messages, my phone buzzed with a new text from Tom. It was a simple message, a photo of us from one of our recent trips, captioned, "I love you." And in that moment everything became clear. I looked at Jason's message, then at the photo Tom had sent, and I felt a wave of clarity wash over me. I knew with a certainty I hadn't felt before, that my future wasn't with Jason, no matter how much a part of me had wanted it to be. My life, my love, my happiness, everything I truly valued was with Tom. So with a deep breath I typed out one final message to Jason, a message that would finally close this chapter of my life for good. I told him that our time together had meant something, that it had shown me parts of myself I hadn't known existed. But I also told him that I couldn't keep looking back, that I had a life, a love, a future that I needed to honor. Jason didn't respond, and I knew he wouldn't. He was a part of my past now, a memory I would carry with me, but nothing more. And as I looked at Tom's photo, at the love and warmth in his eyes, I felt a sense of peace settle within me. I'd made my choice, and this time it felt final. I deleted Jason's number, closed my phone, and walked into the next room where Tom was sitting, reading a book, his face peaceful and familiar. I sat down beside him, taking his hand in mine, feeling a quiet joy settle over me. A joy that came from knowing that I was exactly where I was meant to be. In the end, life isn't about the thrill of fleeting moments or the allure of impossible dreams. It's about choosing to stay, to hold on to the people who love us, who see us, who are willing to fight for us, even when we can't see it ourselves. And as I looked at Tom, I knew that I had found my happiness, not in the excitement of something new, but in the quiet, steady love that had been there all along. In the weeks that followed, a sense of calm settled over me, a peace I hadn't known for a long time. Life with Tom felt fuller, richer, as though we were rediscovering each other in ways I never thought possible. The small things began to matter more. The way he would pull me close when we watched movies, or the little notes he'd leave in my bag for me to find at work. He didn't know everything, but I could sense that he understood something had shifted between us. He must have felt the wall between us crumble, leaving something raw and fragile, but also real. One night, we decided to go out to one of our favorite spots, an old jazz club downtown where we'd spent many nights when we were younger. The dim lights and soulful music wrapped around us, creating a cocoon that felt intimate and timeless. As we sipped our drinks, Tom looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in a long time, a mixture of tenderness, curiosity, and perhaps even a touch of admiration. He reached across the table, took my hand in his, and said, "I don't think I've told you this enough lately, but I am so lucky to have you." His words made my heart swell, the sincerity in his voice reminding me of all the reasons I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. In that moment, I felt myself leaning in, letting go of the lingering memories of Jason, of the thrill and uncertainty, of the woman I'd been with him. This was where I belonged, with Tom, in the safety and strength of his love, a love that didn't demand or take but simply was. I felt my heart steady, a warmth spreading through me that reassured me I'd made the right choice. As we danced, swaying slowly to the rhythm of the music, Tom held me close, his cheek resting against my hair. "I've missed this," he whispered, and I felt the weight of his words, the quiet longing that we'd both carried in silence. We spent the night wrapped in each other's arms, laughing, sharing stories, talking about our hopes and dreams as though we were still the young couple who had first walked through those doors years ago. And yet, there was something deeper now, a quiet resilience that had grown out of everything we'd faced, the secrets, the heartache, the rebuilding of something I'd almost let slip away. I felt grateful for the chance to have that, to choose him and to be chosen in return. After that night, I threw myself wholeheartedly into our life together. I stopped checking my phone compulsively, stopped looking over my shoulder, stopped letting my mind wander back to a life that wasn't mine. I became more present, more aware of the beauty in the simple moments we shared. Cooking breakfast together on lazy Sunday mornings, going on long walks in the neighborhood, planning small weekend trips that reminded us of the adventures we used to take. I felt a kind of contentment settle into my bones, a quiet happiness that was steady and real, a happiness I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Months passed, and with each day, I felt Jason's memory fade, like a distant echo that grew quieter with time. I didn't erase him completely, he was still a part of me, a reminder of a moment in my life when I'd strayed, when I'd forgotten who I was. But he no longer haunted me. He no longer held any power over me. I'd made my peace with him, with the choices I'd made, and with the woman I'd become because of it all. One evening, as we were watching the sunset from our porch, Tom turned to me, a soft smile on his face. "You seem different," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Happier. Stronger, maybe." I looked at him, a smile tugging at my lips. "I feel that way," I admitted, the truth settling comfortably between us. "I feel whole. Like I've found something I thought I'd lost." He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "I don't know what happened and I don't need to know," he said quietly. "But I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you came back to me." Those words stayed with me, wrapping around me like a warm embrace. I realized then that love isn't about perfection. It's about forgiveness, about choosing each other even when it's hard, even when the world threatens to pull you apart. It's about finding your way back to each other time and time again, and being willing to rebuild, to start anew, no matter how many times it takes. In the end, Tom and I found a love that was deeper, richer, more resilient than it had ever been before. We weren't the same people we'd been when we first met, and our relationship had weathered storms I hadn't anticipated. But we'd come out stronger, more grounded, and more committed to each other in ways that felt profound and lasting. Looking back, I realized that the journey wasn't easy, and there were moments when I thought I'd lost everything, moments when the thrill of something new had blinded me to the beauty of what I already had. But now, standing by Tom's side, feeling the strength of his hand in mine, I know that I wouldn't trade this life for anything. I've found my peace, my happiness, my home. And as we watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, I felt a deep, unwavering gratitude for the life we'd built together. A life that was real, imperfect, and exactly where I wanted to be.